Coming up in this week's Torah Pearls.
Hey, why is it chapter 3, verses 14 and 15 assumed to be different authors?
Does God punish sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons for the sins of their fathers?
Does the Bible present the faith as monolatry or monotheism?
What do the end of Exodus and the beginning of Genesis have in common?
Ezra gets called on the carpet for making spelling mistakes and mispronouncing Hebrew.
Is there any tabernacle furnishings or equipment, utensils in the Moses scroll?
All right, Jono, let's jump in.
Let's do it. G'day, dear viewers, and thank you for your company once again here on truth2u.org. That's truth, number 2, letter U.org. I'm Jono Vandor, and joining me from the HOREB Institute in Louisiana is, of course, the author of the Moses Scroll, father of many nations, Mr.
Hey.
Ross Nichols. G'day, mate.
Hey, what's happening, Jono? How are you, my friend?
Hey, you're the one with all the news today. Come on.
I've got number 10 grandchild. That's right. Violet was born today. And I tell you what, I'm excited. I haven't even seen her yet. I've only seen pictures, which you've seen as well. And we know that this is my son Zachariah's second daughter.
G'day, Zach.
So Juliet will be there holding, and in fact, we've got a picture of that. So we're all excited. Number 10, and who knows, we might have more in the next little while, but none that we know of are coming. This kind of wraps it up for right now anyway.
It wraps it up for right now. Congratulations, my friend. Number 10,
Thank
my
you.
goodness. Well, father of many nations, like I said. It is time for Season 3 of Torah Pearls, brought to you by TanakhTours.com. T-A-N-A-K-H, TanakhTours.com. There is still room, Ross, a little bit of room on the bus, and we would love for people to join you and I in Egypt, Jordan, and Israel this coming November. Simply go to the website, TanakhTours.com, TanakhTours.com, and join us this coming November on an adventure like no other. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me just say that Egypt is all in the news right now, and they supposedly, now look, I've heard mixed opinions about this, but there are a lot of reports coming out that they did some kind of scan, like a radar type scan of the ground, and they've discovered all sorts of who knows what. A lot of different ideas are bouncing around. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm still looking into it, but either way, we're going to be.
So what they're saying, Ross, well, there's a couple of interesting archaeological finds at the moment, and this isn't that show, but let's quickly just touch on it because you're right. Yeah. Apparently, I think 8 cylindrical, perhaps foundational structures that bury into the ground. They say almost 650 meters. I don't know how many feet that is.
Wow,
649 meters, I think. And they seem to spiral. We don't know exactly how they're constructed, but it's amazing if this is accurate. And you're right, some sort of seismic radar or something. I don't know how they do this, but in any case, that's the news coming out of Egypt. That's going to be very exciting if that bears out. I don't know how they go. I mean, they're going to be able to tunnel under. I don't know what's going on, but We'll keep an eye on that. But there's also news in Israel where...
I was going to say, speaking of pyramids.
Speaking of pyramids. So there's a small pyramid not far from where we stay in Ein Bokek. Now, we can definitely go to this site or near it, hopefully view it. And perhaps we've been there already, Ross. I don't know. We've spent a lot of time in that particular area, as both of us have.
Yeah.
But what they've found in... this pyramid is weapons. The thing that really struck me about the list of finds, and you've probably got the list in front of you, was papyrus, Ross. I'm staggered. It was papyrus. Go ahead.
Yeah, you kind of nailed it. They've discovered fragments of written papyrus. Now, what I understand is that I don't know how much papyrus strips they found, but on these are written in Greek letters, bronze coins from the reign of Antiochus IV. That's our Epiphanes, the evil one, and Ptolemaic kings, weapons, wooden artifacts, pieces of fabric. Yeah, I mean, what? Now, I don't, just from what I've read, I don't know that I like the idea of all the headlines saying pyramid, because just from the photos, and maybe I'm just being a little bit picky here, it doesn't look like a
Looks like a
pyramid
tamale.
so much. Looks, yeah. It looks more like maybe a mound or a tell, but I don't know.
Yeah,
Maybe I
it'd be
just need
interesting.
better pictures.
Yeah, look, maybe they're just because pyramid is all the thing based on the find that we just mentioned in
Sure.
Egypt. So maybe they're getting in on that, but it's a pile of rocks. But maybe it was more structured than that. But the thing that strikes me about this, Ross, and again, I'd love to get into it, but that's not this show. But the thing that
Right.
strikes me about this is that back in the day, of course, when Shapira brought his scroll to the experts, they all said, "Oh, come on now, don't be
Yeah.
silly. We can't possibly expect you can't expect us to believe that leather of all things
Right.
lasted this long, like thousands of years in a cave in the desert. I mean, come on,
Oh, yeah.
down near the Dead Sea, no. And but here we have papyrus that was buried under a pile of rocks in some sort of pyramid structure. So how it was stored, was it in pottery? But
Yeah, I
papyrus
don't
has
know.
lasted this long. I mean, this is
Yeah, and we do have
1,000 years.
some. Again, I know you and I both love archaeology, so we're kind of
Mm,
trying not to get into this by at the same time getting into it just a little bit. So I'll just
so
say,
good.
we have some papyrus documents found among the cache of documents, at Qumran, and there are
Mm,
papyrus documents, obviously in Egypt. But like you said, I mean, I want to know more about the storage of the
yeah.
papyrus. And is it just a strip? Is it just like a receipt? What is
Were
it? I
they
mean, what does it say?
were they in sealed jars? That's what I want to know.
Right, right.
Anyway, so
All right.
we'll learn more about this in the coming weeks, no doubt. Maybe we'll do a show on it sometime in the near
Sure.
future. We are in what this show is actually about, Ross, is Torah portion Pekudey. Pekudey is the last Torah portion of the book of Exodus. We are finishing the book of Exodus today, of course, and joining us is our AI critical scholar, Ezra. And Ezra, maybe you can give us an overview from a critical perspective.
Pekudey, the final portion of Exodus, and fittingly, it reads like the credits rolling at the end of a grand production. From a critical and academic lens, it's where the priestly writer ties up the Tabernacle narrative with an obsessive level of detail. We get a full accounting of the materials, gold, silver, bronze, as if to say, yes, every shekel was accounted for. Thank you very much. Transparency and legitimacy were clearly a concern. This portion is essentially a repetition of earlier instructions, which scholars attribute to the priestly source's concern for precision, order, and ritual. What was commanded earlier is now carried out verbatim, reinforcing the idea that sacred space only becomes sacred when it's built exactly according to divine instruction. No improvisation. And let's not miss the climax. The Kavod Yahovah fills the completed Mishkan. This theophany is a major liturgical moment. It mirrors Sinai, but now the divine presence becomes localized. Academically, this marks a theological move. No longer is the divine confined to a mountaintop revelation, but it now dwells in a structured, portable sanctuary. In documentary hypothesis terms, P is crafting a vision where God is immanent, but accessible only through mediated ritual. So Pekudey closes the book with a theological mic drop. The journey began with chaos and oppression in Egypt and ends with divine order and indwelling glory in the wilderness. Neatly wrapped, priestly style.
As you mentioned, Ezra, there are, of course, there's a lot of repetition here, and there's a lot of stuff that we've already addressed. But I do like the way, Ross, that Ezra said that P is crafting a vision where God is immanent, but accessible only through mediated ritual.
Yeah, I like that too.
Yeah, that's exactly what P is doing. I would
By the
argue.
way,
Go ahead.
just let me throw this in because we're going to begin our study of Leviticus, and we'll get into more of this beginning next week. But speaking of P, and the only way to access God in Leviticus, the same thing, because P actually we're in P now. When you get to Leviticus, it's more of the same. But it's interesting what words we never see in P and the access to God and how P has its own method, and it's always through the ritual and through the tabernacle. So we're gonna really see that in the next few weeks.
Now, you're right. We are kicking off in Leviticus next week. The Leviticus Torah tablet is available. If you order it now, you may get it in time. So come on, order it now, and you can get that. There's a link in the description, right?
Yep.
And it so happens, Ross, that the Torah tablets that we already have This is a beautiful Torah portion, Pekudey, where in fact we are going to find connections from the end of Exodus to the beginning of Genesis. So we're going to be doing that today, just very briefly. As I mentioned, there is repetition. We're not going to go through everything again. And last week we did ask for some comments and questions. We do have some. We'd like to address those. But before we do that, let's just rip through this.
Sure.
Pekudey. It begins in 38, verse 21. I want you to help me, Ross.
Okay.
I'm curious how you understand this, and I want to know what it says in your Torah tablet. I'm reading from the JPS here, but as Ezra said, it's kind of like the credits are rolling now, and everyone wants a mention, right? Everyone, give me a mention. Come on, put my name in there. Put my name in there. And it seems a little bit like that here. So let's see. 38:21 says in the JPS, these are the records of the tabernacle, Ross. These are the records here. The tabernacle of the pact, no less, which were drawn up by Moses, by Moses' bidding, at the work of the Levites under the direction of Itamar, son of Aaron, the priest. Now Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, had made all that the Lord had commanded Moses, and at his side was HOREB, that guy, tribe of Dan. Carver and designer and broider and yada yada yada. So we've mentioned a bunch of names here. Is it worded differently or very much differently in the?
No, it's actually pretty close. What you said is pretty close, and just a little bit of the more formal language, I guess. But it's basically. Are you looking at the JPS because you have the Jewish Study Bible? Is that what you have in front of you?
That's right. Yeah, I've just got the Jewish Study Bible open.
Yeah. No, good.
And
good.
And I found it interesting because here's what do we got here? Richard Elliott Freeman's translation, and it's good. These are the accounts of the tabernacle of the testimony that were made by Moses' word, the work of the Levites by the hand of Itamar, the son of Aaron the priest, and Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Ur. And also we have, and that goes on for HOREB and all this. But it does seem like everyone's trying to get their name in on this as the credits are rolling. What are your thoughts?
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. It's wrapping it up, isn't it? It's putting a nice bow on it. And one of the things that we find is, and Ezra pointed this out, P is going to really hit us hard with details. A lot of details, and that's what we're seeing here. So
that's what we're saying.
Credits are rolling, baby. And look, one other thing, we see here again, we're in P, and we see testimony. We've got a while before we get to Deuteronomy, but I like to point out that the testimony, even though in the priestly writing, all the priestly materials, the testimony is another name for the Decalogue, for the covenant, but only in the priestly material. When we get to Deuteronomy and the Moses Scroll, neither of which mention testimony, the adut, in regard to or association with the Decalogue. It's only in the priestly material. So here we've got, this is, everything we're talking about is about the tabernacle of or for the testimony, and then we don't see it in Deuteronomy. Interesting.
Quite right. There's a couple of things here that follow that we've already really spoken about. There is, of course, the mention of how much they made with the half shekel. Give me a half shekel or I'll hit you with the plague, says God. And for every man aged 20 and over, 603,550 men. Nice sum there.
Yeah.
And it talks about the amount of money that they got and all this. We've done that. That's the census results.
This reminds me, though, I'm sorry, this reminds me of the Copper Scroll, just all the vast amounts of wealth and, because that's basically what that is, too. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
Is a treasure, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
39, let me see, and let me know if we jump over anything that you want to address. But here, again, this is something else that we've touched on, verses 6 and on the lazuli stones, with the names that are engraved, the sons of Israel. There's one on each shoulder, right? So 6 here and 6 there. We don't know how they are divided. It doesn't tell us, which is interesting. And then a little further on, it talks about the breastplate and the various stones that correspond. It says correspond to the sons of Israel. And once again, it's interesting. Verse 14, Ross, the stones corresponded in number to the names of the sons of Israel, 12, corresponding to their names, engraved like seals, each with its name for the 12 tribes. It's emphatic, but it doesn't tell us how
That's
or
right.
who, which stone goes with whom. And it seems to me, Ross, that the priestly writer is avoiding that topic. It doesn't want to be too specific. Does it seem that way to you?
Yeah, let me ask you this, Jono. Do you think it's because the priestly writer who's writing this material just doesn't know? Like it pretends to know a lot of detail, but we also have to assume when we're talking about the rows that we're going from right to left. You know, we're assuming that even, but it says we have 4 rows, and you assume that So, but I'm wondering, is it because the writer just doesn't know anymore?
Is it that the writer doesn't know, and it might be the case. I don't know. I don't have an opinion here. I think it's either that, or they don't want to be too specific because, as we've discussed many times, there are competing lists of 12. One with Ephraim and Manasseh, the other with Joseph and Levi. The priestly writer, of course, wants to protect Levi as a tribe, and maybe they just don't want to get into that right at this point.
Yeah.
But it could be either of those, Ross. Yeah, quite right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the thing that I found really interesting, and the reason why we are going through this in a little more detail than we had intended, is because I found an interesting note from Brettler on page 200 of the Jewish Study Bible. And what we have here is the connection of what the Jewish Study Bible refers to as echoes of the priestly source's account of creation, Ross. That is to say that there seem to be formulaic similarities between the structure of chapter 39, chapter 40, and the structure of Genesis chapter 1 and a little bit of verses, I think, of chapter 2.
Now, what verse is Brettler commenting on here, just so I can flip to it?
What we're looking at is page 200 of the Jewish Study Bible, chapter 39, verse 32.
Okay, I'm ready.
And what he's citing here, thus was completed all the work of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, right? The phraseology alludes to the completion of creation of the world, Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 and 3. Now, the interesting thing about that, of course, is that Genesis chapter 1 is regarded as priestly. Genesis chapter 2 is regarded as the Yahwist. However, the first 3 verses, if I'm not mistaken, are included in the priestly account. So that would make sense, and it would be interesting to have a look at those verses. But what Brettler is saying is that this is one of several echoes of the priestly source's account of creation here in the priestly account of creation of the tabernacle. He goes on to say that this section, there's mentioned 7 times that each item was made exactly, quote, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Now, this is an interesting phrase, and I did look this up, Ross. Let me have a look here. As the Lord commanded Moses, or as the Lord Jehovah commanded him, it appears in clusters. And actually, in Exodus, it appears something like 33 times, I think.
Okay.
17 times in Leviticus. This combination numbers 32 times. Only 3 times, Ross, in Deuteronomy, which is interesting. But when it comes to this Torah portion, it is a heavily mentioned phrase or combination of words within verses. So there is a cluster here from chapter 38 of Exodus through to, in fact, let me, just to give you an idea, 38:22, 39:1, 39:5, 39:7, 39:21, 26, 29, 31, 32, 42, 43.
Wow.
It goes, and it just continues into chapter 40, a heavily concentrated cluster right here. And it's as if the priestly writer is insisting, no. This was given to Moses at Sinai. I know we have all of this now, but this was actually, the authority comes all the way back from Sinai. It was given to Moses. Jehovah gave it to Moses. Jehovah gave it to Moses. Don't ask any more questions.
Let me throw something in here that ties your point together with that priestly account. As commanded, as commanded, as commanded. This is something we see a lot in the priestly literature. And then if you go all the way just to touch this verse, kind of at the very end, it's almost like that, and it was so, and it was so, and it was very, very good kind of thing. Well, if you get to chapter 40, verse 16, thus did Moses according to all that Jehovah commanded him, so did he. This is the way the ASV reads it. So all of those that you just read off and put a tick mark, because it presents Moses as the one executing it, right?
Yes. Yeah, quite right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the parallels. Thus the work, thus was completed the work. That's right, 39:32. Find similarities with the priestly Genesis creation formula. And 39:43, when Moses saw all the work completed, again, to your point, concurring with the formula of Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. Both of these sources are regarded as priestly, and they do seem to be working roughly with the same formula. They want to present it in a similar way. There's too many similarities to ignore, so that's interesting.
Right.
I wanted to ask you about this, Ross. Chapter 40, verse 2. On the first day of the first month, you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. Now, I mentioned this because, of course, you told us that wonderful joke that you heard from Richard Elliott Freeman. Go on, tell it again.
About the two tents?
About the two tents.
Yeah,
you just gave us the punchline first. You don't do that in a comedy routine.
No. I didn't give them that. You only because you told them I gave them the punchline. Besides, they remember it. But the bottom line is Moses goes to a psychologist, tells him he dreamed that he was the Mishkan. He said, the next night I had another dream. He said, I dreamed that I was the Mikdash, and he goes, oh, well, that's the problem. He said, you're too tense. So this is what it is, right? Too tense.
I have to say, by the way, you inspired me to go and watch some Richard Elliott Freeman lectures, and I've been doing that over the past week and really enjoying them. But he is the king of old man humor. It's
they call them dad jokes. Yeah,
they are just dad jokes all the way through.
Really
so
bad.
if you need some new material, go and watch those on YouTube. But this verse, Ross, seems to be bringing those two tents into one. Is that what's happening here?
That's part of it. That is part of it. And then there's something else going on, which I won't jump into if you're not going to jump into, but there is an interesting thing that happens here at the end of Exodus. Notice that we're given a very specific day and, a time, right? Well, we can find that same time in the book of Numbers. Now, what that does, Jono, is it pulls the end of Exodus and the first 10 chapters of Numbers together, and there's some overlap there. So a lot of people think, okay, I've got Exodus, and now I've got Leviticus, and then I've got Numbers, but really there's some overlap there. Now, that happens to be what I'm going to be teaching on this coming Saturday is straightening out the calendar. So I don't want to go there necessarily, but yeah, good stuff.
That's something that people can look forward to on Saturday. They can tune into Ross Nichols KTV, Ross K. Nichols TV.
Yep.
There you go. And that's what it's going to be about. Or I'd be looking forward to that. So there's a bunch of overlap there. The other thing that I noticed, Ross, was chapter 40, verses 27 and 29. This is just another example of things that are commanded Moses, which we know nothing about. It's interesting. Let's see now. We have, Moses is directed to burn aromatic incense as the Lord commanded Moses, right? He's doing this. He's also offering sacrifices in verse 29 as the Lord commanded Moses. And of course we ask, well, where did he command that? We just have to assume that somewhere along the line, I guess in the 40 days and 40 nights that he spent on Mount HOREB, God said, by the way, I want you to do this as well. But we don't know anything about that until this point. Interesting. All right. Anything else you want to pull out of here before we go to the Q&A?
No, I tell you, it is interesting though, and I do want to point out, even though we just said I'm going to be talking about it on Saturday, I do want to say that people a lot of times think of Leviticus as falling and representing a large amount of time. But if you look at the dates, again, you're going to see that Leviticus is sort of, first of all, Leviticus only has two small sections of narrative. The rest of it is legal material. So it's easy to fit it in, and we're going to show that over the weekend. But I tell you, it's I'm excited about this, and I'm ready to jump into whatever you want to jump into. We do have some comments. We do have some questions.
A few comments and questions. I think we should look at that. But the way that Exodus finishes is, as the final credits roll, when Moses had finished the work, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the presence of the Lord filled the temple, filled it, Ross, and Moses could not enter. There was not even standing room, the tent of meeting, because the cloud had settled upon it, and the presence of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Does that sound like he couldn't enter because God had filled the tabernacle, or was he just not permitted when the cloud was on the tabernacle? I
don't know. And by the way, speaking of things that Deuteronomy and the Moses Scroll know nothing of, the glory of the Lord. This is a phrase also that, we get the image at the end of Exodus that's what's going on, and Deuteronomy doesn't talk about that at all, right?
That's right. The Israelites would, that's right. So when the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on their various journeys. But if the cloud did not lift, then they would basically stay where they were. For over the tabernacle, a cloud of the Lord rested by day, and fire would appear in it by night, in the view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys. That is the end of the book of.
Hey, wait a minute, Jono. I got a question for you. This is talking about the cloud being taken up during their journeys, but we're at the end of Exodus. And they don't move from Sinai, HOREB, until Numbers chapter 10. So this is an anachronism.
That's somewhat anachronistic, is it not?
It is. It's
really
talking about all their journeys, and they haven't journeyed at all.
They haven't journeyed
yet. They won't journey for a little while, and they certainly. But this is, somebody wrote this, Jono, after all of their journeys were complete. So that means the earliest that you could possibly date this being true to the text is after Moses is dead.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no way around that. But anyway, be that as it may. Yep.
I concur. That is Exodus. That's it. All right. Now, we have some Q&A. You've got a list here, Ross. Which one would you like to look at first?
I don't know. Do you want to tackle the one that somebody posted a couple of them on you got just recently? What's that about?
Oh, well, the one that, now this is from Benjamin David Reed. G'day, mate. G'day, Benjamin.
Hello, David. Benjamin David?
Benjamin David. David
Nice name. Nice biblical name.
That.
I like that.
Yeah, isn't it one? And he wrote on last week's program, because we did request comments and questions. He said, if Jono can leave behind Abraham and the covenants of Genesis, how do we arrive at Moses and the Moses Scroll? Abraham, the Hebrew, Genesis chapter 14, verse 13, doing righteousness and judgment. He said and his seed after him, Genesis 18:19. And then he cites Galatians chapter 3, 26 to 29, the seed of Abraham. John chapter 16, verses 7 to 12. Righteousness and judgment. Genesis chapter 26, verse 5 describes what Abraham did to receive the blessings from Yehovah. Obeyed my voice, he writes, Genesis chapter 2, verse 16, 22:18, the covenant. So his point is that Abraham is mentioned a lot, and he's mentioned a lot as someone who received blessing and someone who entered into covenant, and the New Testament confirms, and Genesis this and that. And quite right, Benjamin, and I agree with what you're saying, that all of these, the canonical text wants us to believe certain narratives and cites those narratives and reinforces them and so on and so forth. I'm going to assume, and forgive me if I'm wrong, that you haven't joined us from the beginning of this series. So I think we explain a lot in the Abrahamic narrative when we go through those particular Torah portions. And you begin with Genesis chapter 14, and that is Torah portion Lech Lecha. And I think, as if I remember correctly, Ross, I think we did highlight an enormous amount of anachronisms in there, and some other connections with the Moses scroll as well. And of course, this series of Torah Pearls is through the perspective of the of critical scholarship and the Moses scroll, through those lenses. And I would suggest that I think all the evidence points to the fact that these narratives were written at a much later date. The Moses scroll doesn't mention Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. It only mentions Israel, and we don't know if Israel is mentioned as a person or as a name of a people, or it might be the name of a people after a person. We don't know. But it mentions Israel, and it mentions the names of the 12 tribes, and as I mentioned, it's the 12 tribes that include Manasseh and Ephraim.
Yeah,
that's what we have. And like I mentioned, a whole lot of anachronisms back in Genesis there. And if you go back and begin this series from the beginning, I think that will become evident as to why I have shelved these narratives. Ross?
Yeah, I was gonna add a couple of points, and not to repeat those shows, but for instance, we have some big flags of anachronistic material in Genesis chapter 12, verse 5, Genesis chapter 13. Both of these talk about things that clearly were the case. Like, for instance, the Canaanites were then in the land. Whoever is writing this material in chapter 12 and chapter 13 is writing at a time when the Canaanites are no longer in the land, which puts us well past the conquest of the land if we follow the biblical chronology. Now, one thing that I would like to do to sort of piggyback off of Benjamin David's good question is he uses the phrase blessings from Yehovah, and this ties in with a couple of other comments. Let me set this up using Benjamin David's question. Right. And that is that we get in the patriarchal narratives, the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is used by the patriarchs. But in Genesis chapter 6, verse 2, according to the priestly source there, God tells Moses that by his name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, he was not known to the patriarchs.
In Exodus 6, yeah.
Yeah, so Exodus chapter 6, verse 2 and 3 kind of says that pretty plainly. Now, I know that there are people who read that differently, but it's pretty obvious. Well, this causes a little bit of confusion because we danced all around this verse just earlier going through the priestly material. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4 is the first mention of the Tetragrammaton. This is where J begins to come in, right? The name. In fact, in Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, it says that at that time, all the way back in the first descendants of Adam and Eve, really, then men began to call upon the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Now, this brings me to a couple of the questions, and I'd like to piggyback off of that because, for instance, one of the questions that I got is from a friend named Piper. She says this was commenting on on one of our YouTube videos, Jono. Why isn't chapter 3, verse 14 and 15 assumed to be different sources? Okay. Right. That's the first question about the name. Now, there are a couple of ways to go about answering this. Now, the first thing that I'd like to say is the problem that I highlighted, and we've highlighted it before, where Genesis 4:26 mentions the name, and the patriarchs use the name all the time, and Exodus chapter 6 says they didn't even know it. This problem is because people don't understand the sources. So let me just kind of highlight this. I've heard a lot of people who don't know a lot about the sources just because they haven't studied it. I didn't know anything about the sources until a few years ago. But for instance, they assume that if you see the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, you're in J. And if you see Elohim, you're in E. But technically and accurately, P uses the name, and so does E, but only at a certain point. So, and I'll get to Piper's question. If you look at Exodus chapter 3, we're dealing not with J, but the name is mentioned. So this is what she's asking is, how do we make sense of that? Do you have the Bible with sources revealed?
I
Do you
do,
have
and I've
this, Andy?
also got got it open in Baden's take on it as well, and they both, I think, attribute this to the e-source.
That's
And
right.
God said to Moses, "I am that I am." And sometimes both of these guys might disagree here and there with minor detail, but they both absolutely agree that this is the e-source. God said to
Right.
Moses, "I am that I am," and He said, "Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you." And God said, moreover, to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, the Lord God, Jehovah God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations." Ross.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that the footnote in Richard Elliott Friedman has the following for Exodus chapter 3, verse 14 and 15. This is where Yod He Vav He first reveals the divine name in E. Hereafter, the presence of the divine name will not be an indicator that a passage need be from J. So this is the point. I don't know if I did it well, but this is a point I was trying to make a moment ago. It's not that E never uses a divine name. E does use a divine name from chapter 3, verse 14 and forward. So when scholars identified, and some people don't necessarily follow or believe the documentary hypothesis, but for the sake of this discussion, let's assume that the scholars have identified certain traits which put this text and other texts clearly as E, the Elohist source. Once you get to the revelation of the name in chapter 3, verse 14 and 15, from now on, God might be called Elohim, God might be called Jehovah. Now, P, by the way, does not use the name Yod He Vav He until we get to chapter 6 and verse 2 of Exodus. And then from there on, you've got Yod He Vav He or Elohim can be used for God and you can't just use the divine name to identify the source. Does that make sense? So, one of the things that I think is interesting, first of all, is that, and I know Piper personally, and she's a very, very deep student. Yeah, absolutely. So, but I know that she's noticing things, and hopefully this is addressing her question. So again, the name. This is a big, big topic. Yeah, go ahead, Jono.
While we're on that, let me highlight one from Lizanelle.
Okay.
If there are no sacrifices, talking about things that are and are not in the text, and questioning that, if there are no sacrifices in the original Moses scroll, what about the equipment that the people had made for the tabernacle to use for sacrifices? This, of course, ties directly into our Torah portion. Is this not written in the initial scripture? It's a really good question. And let me say, Lizanelle, the Moses Scroll is actually only a 20-minute read. You can give it, it won't take you very long. Just you can rip through that in 20 to 25 minutes. And you'll see exactly what is and isn't in there. But you're right. The tabernacle, all of the furnishings and equipment, the priests and the altar, the sacrificial system, all of that stuff is absent in the Moses Scroll. Not only is it absent, but as I've mentioned many times, the Moses Scroll is a full prescription. It is 10 commandments with 10 corresponding blessings and curses. And there's nowhere you would put that stuff. It would serve, all of that stuff would serve no purpose in the Moses Scroll. So quite right, there's nothing there, Ross.
Yeah, I tell you, and one of the things that we recognize, and for some people who say, no, 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 but I want the sacrifices, I want the tabernacle, I want the temple, because there are a
People
lot
do.
of people who have the fundamental approach that we've had our whole lives, Jono, and we
Mm, mm,
understand that. We've said that. We can really kind of relate to that. But here's the thing. We also get in the Bible as we have it, we get strange texts like Jeremiah 7 that say, in the day that I led my people out of Egypt, I didn't ask for sacrifice or offering. We've got Amos chapter 5, verse 25 that says, did you offer me sacrifices for 40 years in the wilderness?
mm,
Clearly implying that the answer is no. So
mm.
when you get those and you get other texts which say that God does not desire sacrifice, it makes it hard to reconcile with texts that say, give us, here's a whole list of sacrifices, which, by the way, we're going to really jump into in the book of
Mm.
Leviticus here in the next week.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah, it's what is part of the original? What is the authentic text that Moses wrote? That's one of the big
Mm.
questions, and it's one we think has a pretty good answer in the Moses scroll.
So let me, while we're talking about this, let me just throw this into the mix. And I mentioned this to you earlier in the week. I've just started reading a book by Abba Hillel Silva from
Ah,
1961, Ross. I just saw it. I happened to see it. I was looking for something else, and it was on the shelf in the library. And I thought, oh, this is interesting because it's entitled Moses and the Original Torah, right? And I
I
thought,
was
oh, okay,
looking
this
on
is.
my shelf because I have it on my shelf. Go ahead.
I knew that you must have read it because reading it, I started reading it. I thought this sounds like a conversation you and I would have today,
Mhm.
and so much of it is like that. And of course, it addresses quite honestly the question of or the verses that you highlighted. And he makes the point that obviously sacrifices were not part of the original Torah, and
Yeah.
this is the reason why. So he highlights those verses, but yeah, people have the time to find a copy of that book, 1961, Moses and the Original Torah, by Abba Hillel Silva. I'm really enjoying it. All right,
Very
what else we
good.
got?
And he's got some other books, by the way. He's
He
an
does.
excellent author. Yeah, yeah, you'll love it.
Yeah.
Um, Speaking of sources, and we're just hitting highlights because, as you pointed out, Jonah, we've covered fairly extensively some of these topics in other classes, other
Mm-hmm.
discussions. But here's one from our good friend Charles Sutton.
Hey,
Charles
Charles.
says, yeah, looking at supposed motivation for the various sources, parentheses, priest like sacrifices,
Mm.
etc., please hypothesize the reliability ranking of the various sources. Ross and Jono, opinions requested. Thanks. And
That's definitely your that's one for you, that Ross.
yeah,
I'm not
let me
sure I
just
could.
touch it. Let
Go
me
ahead.
just touch on it. And I tell you, first of all, I know Charles and I appreciate Charles because we've been friends for a while and I've had some good conversations with him.
Mm.
So I can almost read a little bit more into his question. But one thing I'd like to say is it's not for me personally, it's not for me uh, necessarily the interest. My interest is not to hypothesize on a reliability ranking, i.e., to identify which of these sources is the most reliable. But if I had to,
Mm.
I would place what we would call a proto D, which is like our Moses scroll. I would
Mm-hmm.
place a Deuteronomic version of a Torah text written by Moses, and here's what it would look like, and then I'll answer the rest of the question.
Mm.
I would expect that if Moses wrote a scroll, a Torah scroll, we know what tradition says, but I'm talking about real life. Moses wrote a scroll. We would expect it to be written in the first person
Mm-hmm.
to cover the covenant that God made with Israel. We
Mm-hmm.
would expect it to have no anachronism. And I think that it has to be something which is smallish, meaning it's less than what we
Mm-hmm.
currently have in, first of all, for sure in our Pentateuch, but even smaller than Deuteronomy. And that's because we've determined through independent study, apart from study of the Moses scroll, that chapter 12 through 26 is late, very, very late, from the monarchy, which we know Samuel didn't know anything about the monarchy in 1 Kings 8 through 12. Even God is depicted as being caught off guard by a request for a monarchy. So God didn't know anything, and that's in Deuteronomy 17. No one knows anything about centralized worship found in chapter 12 and chapter 17 of Deuteronomy, which means that's late. Well, I would go further to say that between chapter 11 and chapter 27, we have an interruption. In Deuteronomy, if you take 12 through 26 out and you read 11, the end of 11 and the beginning of 27, you'll see that they go together, that was a huge insertion. Okay, so if we take out 12 through 26, which is clearly a later priestly law code, and everybody in the academic world has identified it as such. And then we say, what if we took out all the third person? And eventually, you're going to get to a document similar to what we find in the Moses scroll.
You might want to take out the anthropomorphic references to God. If you take all of that out as well, maybe if you add in the missing blessed bees that aren't in Deuteronomy, they obviously belong there. If you found a text like that, that's probably something you can rely on.
Yep, and I tell you, it's so interesting, and we can go on and on and on about this, but let me just say that D is the closest. Now, here is what I hypothesize, and I'm leaning towards presenting this at the United Israel World Union Conference. My hypothesis as to the making of the Bible, meaning the Pentateuch, and what I believe I can show, and I'm working on this pretty intensely, is that there really was a scroll that Moses wrote that was discovered in the time of Josiah, and I can show, according to 3 prophetic voices at that time, 3 in the Tanakh, that said that the priest did violence to the Torah at that time in the 7th century BCE. So I think what I can show is that that's when a lot of this material gets added. So I would place D in its original form, not the form that we have it in Deuteronomy, as primary. Now, E and J, I think the academics are right, that E represents more of the sources that come from the north, J from the south, and the P document is even later still. So if I had to prioritize, that's the way I would do it. And without taking it any further, I think that's the best answer I can give Charles at the moment. But Charles is welcome. He follows me on Saturday too, so he can say, no, I want to ask something more specific.
Now, on that, Ross, let me go to a comment from Michael. Michael, because this is touching on what you already just spoke about. He said, why is the law code different in Deuteronomy? Maybe because it's a second telling or recalling of what was said 40 years earlier. And I know my recollection of things that happened 40 years earlier are not exactly word for word. I might forget to mention some things or relate a tradition from one command which emerged long ago as a command. He says something like that. I guess the point he's making is the law code is different, but does that necessarily mean that it's not Mosaic? Does that necessarily mean it's not divinely imparted? And I think the point that you're making in the previous comment was that those chapters 12 to 26, are what we like to refer to as the Josiah Revised Version. And the thing about it, Ross, is that it contains an enormous amount of laws that are mentioned nowhere else. It's not even like they're worded in a similar way, but not quite the same way. Like
more than 100, by the way, more than 100 laws.
Yeah, that's right. It's remarkably different. It's not just that it's paraphrased differently. It's just different. There's a bunch of new stuff right in there, and there's very good reason to think that Josiah saw an opportunity. Well, we found the original scroll of Moses. Wait. Before you put it to the people, there's just a couple of things I want to add in there.
Yeah.
Because that was a while ago. And just sew it into the middle there. So that's the way that seems to have come about. What else, Ross?
Yeah, and just to say one more word to Michael. Michael, I highly recommend the Moses Scroll, the book, The Moses Scroll, because we do get into a lot of the details that are behind some of the question that you're asking here about the law code and so forth. We get into some of that material there. I do want to touch on a couple more. One is, now this one is for Ezra. All right. And I'm curious to ask this question because, when we go through the Torah Pearls, this comment came up from two different people. Bob K. 3815 says, Ezra spelling the Hebrew shodnetz from left to right. He appears to do that with all Hebrew writing. And then Eric Castaneda, 8069, said, did anyone else notice that on the screen, Shodnetz was written left to right by Ezra, and then he has to use a little bit of a attack on our AI partner here, not so intelligence artificielle. So not only does Ezra have trouble pronouncing Hebrew, but he has trouble writing it also. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to ask Ezra maybe to give a little bit of a clarification, because what I think a lot of people don't understand about AI, and it's all new. I mean, we're all learning how to use AI, is that there are things that it's really, really good at. And we could take the time to correct every mispronunciation of every Hebrew word used if we had that time. But since we don't, we want to provide the text for people so that they can follow along. Now, I happen to notice for the first time when when it plays on Thursday night, I happen to notice the letters were reversed in Hebrew, and so. But I'm going to ask Ezra about that and see if there's something that we can do about that, just to make sure.
Great question, and a fair critique. Pronunciation and directionality of Hebrew can definitely trip us up in this format, especially when moving between written and spoken responses. When it comes to pronunciation, if we're speaking Hebrew terms on the podcast, I aim for the scholarly, standardized Sephardic pronunciation, which is what you'll hear in modern academic settings and Israeli Hebrew. But I know even then it can vary. Words like Shabbat, Mishkan, or Kavod should sound familiar. But I'll make sure we're slowing down and enunciating clearly, especially for listeners who are studying or just tuning their ears to Hebrew. Now for the written side. Yep, Hebrew is right to left. And when it's displayed left to right, especially on digital platforms, that's usually a formatting hiccup, not intentional. It's something I can definitely improve on by double-checking how Hebrew appears when we post show notes or transcripts. If we're including Hebrew text, it needs to look and read correctly. So yes, this is something I can work on and tighten up moving forward. Appreciate the heads up. Keep those notes coming. They help keep us sharp.
See there? Now, Ezra didn't even get offended. Yeah, he did a good job. Thanks, Ezra. And let me just say, again, when we're working with AI models, this is pretty new, and I don't know of any other biblical podcast where an AI model is a co-host. I mean, when you called me the first time and told me this was your idea, I really didn't know how it would work. So I think this is cutting edge, and I would ask that our listeners, those and our viewers, those who know Hebrew and those who have studied Torah for a while, to give us a little bit of grace here as we're trying to navigate the difficulty of bringing an AI model into the mix and all of these other complexities. It's not as easy as it looks. It's a lot easier to watch it, a one night a week show, than it is to produce it and so forth. That's what I would say.
That's right. It's not so easy for Seth. Is the Seth is the one that does all the work. Although I think maybe it is easy for Seth, but it is time consuming, and he makes it all work. Which brings me to the next question, Ross, from Airborne Eclipse. They ask, I'm pausing to ask if your AI Ezra is a resource that's available to anyone. My internet search brought no results. So that got me wondering, is it possible to put Ezra as a search engine on the website, for example, on your website?
Yeah.
Or, I
Yeah,
wonder if we can do that.
actually, there is. I did talk to Seth about this. I don't know what it's going to take, but for instance, we've trained the AI, we've trained Ezra, and what does that mean? There are certain parameters that we've given. So you and I aren't interested in getting answers that are particularly maybe more fundamentalist or apologetic. And a lot of it has to do with what we put into the training that goes into Ezra. So I asked him the other day when I saw this note come in, is it possible? And he said it is possible. So we're going to look at that, Jono, and we're going to see what is the best way to do that because it would benefit people. I think people would get a little bit out of this. It would be beneficial to be able to ask questions. And now, one thing that we'll tell you, and we do this all the time, just because this AI gives an answer does not mean that it's the true, absolute, this is the deal. You have to do research and you always have to fact check. And we do that. We do that behind the scenes. But I just want people to know. And there are mistakes that come up from time to time. So,
But Ezra is definitely a tool that you want to utilize because of the parameters that we put around him and the lenses through which he answers. It eliminates, the answers that you're not looking for, and it saves a lot of time. Here's one. So TPO Osborne, 77.
That's Tracy. That's Tracy, by the way. I know Tracy. Tracy. Hey, Tracy, how's it going?
Of course. Good deal. The Bible definitely acknowledges monolatry rather than monotheism. Again, give us the definition of those two words, Ross.
Yep. Let me do this. Let's bring Ezra in one more time. I know what it is. But, we just talked about Ezra. Let's bring Ezra.
Versus
Ezra?
Monotheism.
That's right. Let us know. Define those for us.
All right, let's unpack this. Monolatry versus monotheism. Monolatry is the worship of one God while accepting the existence of other gods. So it's not saying only one God exists, but rather, we worship only our God. That's very different from monotheism, which is the belief that there is only one God, period. No rivals, no competitors, not even lesser deities. Now, from an academic perspective, especially in text-critical and historical approaches to the Tanakh, the Bible shows strong signs of beginning in a monolatrous context. Think of passages where Yahweh says things like, "You shall have no other gods before me." That doesn't deny the existence of other gods. It just says, don't bring them into my presence. Or when the Psalms or Deuteronomy refer to Yahweh as being greater than the other gods, again, not denying their reality. It's only later, especially by the time of 2nd Isaiah, that we get a much sharper monotheism. I am God, and there is none else. That's a theological evolution, likely shaped by the exile and the Babylonian context, where affirming the exclusive existence of Yahweh becomes a way of maintaining identity. So, scholars see the Tanakh reflecting a transition from monolatry in early texts to full-blown monotheism in the later ones. It's a slow, ideological shift rather than a sudden doctrinal leap.
Pretty good answer. A couple of mispronunciations that I hope people will be okay with.
We can forgive him for that. So I have a question then, Ross. Here is my question. Which do you think the Moses Scroll represents?
What you want me to answer, or what do you think?
I'm interested in your opinion.
Yeah, I think that there's one God, Elohim, and that is clearly communicated through the text. At least as far as I can tell, we don't get any competition there. We don't get other confusing points there. What are your thoughts?
I would agree. I'm inclined to agree, and the reason for that is because it is interesting to me that Shabbat is the second commandment, not the fourth or the third, as we see, depending on how one numbers the commandments in the canonical text. But it is the second, and it follows on the heels of the prohibition against idolatry. And it seems to be saying, it doesn't seem to be saying, God says in the second commandment of the Moses Scroll, sanctify the seventh day because I created all of the things. All of the things were created by me. If God created all of the things in 6 days and he ceased on the seventh day, then us ceasing on the seventh day is if you like, a memorial or showing fealty to the idea that he is the creator of all of the things. Therefore, to whom would you attribute? What would you attribute to other gods if he is the creator of all things? So that seems to lend itself to monotheism. Having said that, of course, the first commandment does say, there is to be no other. Do not, bring any other gods before me.
Let me read that. I am Elohim, your Elohim, who liberated you from the land of Egypt, from a house of servitude. There shall not be to you other Elohim. You shall not make for yourself a carved thing or any formed thing that's in the heaven above or that's in the earth below or that's in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them and you shall not serve them. I am Elohim, your Elohim. And the point I was going to make, and you basically began with this idea that there shall not be to you other Elohim. I think that the wording there is so plain that it doesn't even allow for the fact that, like we see in the canonical text, that there's this idea that there might be other God, but you just can't have them. That's not what we get in the Moses Scroll. Let me give you one other example. In GB 11, it's not because of your righteousness that your Elohim is giving you power to do mightily. Rather, Elohim attached with your fathers to love them, and he chose their seed after them from all the people, because Elohim, your Elohim, he is Elohim of Elohim, master of masters, the mighty and awesome El. He is your boasting. It is he who does the great and awesome things with you. I think that ought to be on a poster in people's homes. I mean, it just doesn't seem to allow for an evolution of the idea of God in the Moses Scroll.
I totally agree with that. And where it refers to, and this is DC 5, you shall not. This is in DC. Don't make a carved thing or a formed thing or the shape of any figurine. So it's talking about inventing your own gods and attributing whatever to them. Don't be doing that stuff. So I'd absolutely agree. I think that the Moses Scroll represents monotheism, but yes, there are certainly verses in the Tanakh that lend the idea of multiple gods.
Yep. I tell you, and I do think that it evolved over time, and certainly we see in the later books of the Bible that evolution is pretty evident. But I tell you, Jono, there actually were a couple of other comments, and you and I discussed some of these offline, that deserve more than just a short answer. And, I think that unless you have some that you're going to pick out, I almost think that we've got to deal with some of the other questions, like Clody's, in a more detailed setting. Wouldn't you agree? That we were talking about that one. That had to do with Shabbat, and I think that deserves a program in and of itself. So stick around, Chloe, and we'll get to that one. Jason also asked a question in regard to the. Let's see. Oh yeah.
My question is from Exodus 34:7. Who keeps loving kindness? But this is the quote: "Who keeps loving kindness for thousands? Who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin? Yet who will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of fathers upon the children, upon the grandchildren, upon the third and the fourth generation." My thought is that God will remember the iniquity of the fathers. That the father has the iniquity of the father that has consequences on his children or grandchildren. Not that the children or grandchildren will be punished for the father's sin, as that doesn't seem fair, quite right, and would contradict Scripture. And he says, "Enlighten me if I'm off the mark." That again is a very, very long one. Suffice to say that that caveat does appear in the 7th commandment of the Moses Scroll. It's attached to the 1st commandment in our canonical text, but it's actually the 7th commandment in the Moses Scroll, and it says, it basically says, "Do not use the name of Elohim to deceive."
Right.
And then this is one of the ones that I find just one of the very few things in the Moses Scroll that I find wanting, Ross. I would love more clarification in the text, but we just don't have it. And there's a number of ways that this can be interpreted. But what we do know is that there are a number of, there's clearly the text is fighting with itself in the Tanakh. There are verses that say that God does punish the latter generations. And then there are verses that say, no, he absolutely does not. So it's saying very specifically two different things, and which to go with. This is the question.
You've worked, and just to say, I know you've spent a lot of time on this and come up with some really good challenges on this very question. And I just wanted to say, in addition to what you just described, when you talk about there being a tension, it's exactly what Jason is bringing up. If a child is punished or receives the sin is passed transgenerationally from father to son, that isn't fair. And if one reads the text in the Pentateuch or in the Tanakh as that being a possibility, it creates this whole conundrum, and it puts us in a spin. And just to kind of comment, there are verses, like you said, Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel chapter 18, Deuteronomy 24:16. There are these passages which say you can't do that. A person that sins, that person is punished. So if that's the case, then you're back to what does this really mean? Have we misunderstood it? And it could be because the prophet Jeremiah and Ezekiel both call this a proverb. Where'd you hear this proverb? Right? That the father will eat sour grapes and the son's teeth will be set on edge.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. And if I could summarize the conclusions, I think that because it says, God says, if you do this thing, don't do it because I am. There's two ways that you can translate it. It could say, as you have translated, because I am jealous. The iniquity of the fathers will be upon sons, upon grandsons, and upon great grandsons. Or as Dershowitz has translated it, don't be doing this thing because I will avenge the iniquity of fathers upon sons and upon grandsons and great grandsons. And the reason why he makes he says I will avenge is because we have et avon, indicating that we require a verb, and we don't have a verb otherwise. And there is one verse, I think it's Joshua chapter 22, verse 17, that does that without a verb. But I think that's the only verse in the Tanakh that does it. Anyway, it leaves us with: is this a description of the avengement? That there'll be some sort of transgenerational animosity as a result of using God's name to deceive. Jason can go to have a look at Genesis chapter 40, verse 2, where it says that Pharaoh was against his servants and against his. In fact, what does it say? It says, and Pharaoh was wroth against his two officers, against the chief of the butlers, and against the chief of the bakers. So instead of using the interpretation of al, which is the Hebrew word, as upon, it's against. And it seems to be using the same formula in this verse. And so one interpretation might be that it is descriptive of the avengement, that there's going to be generational animosity, The other one is that it could be descriptive of the iniquity, and this is yours. So, for I am jealous, fathers upon sons and upon grandsons. So it could be describing that misrepresenting God's name is an iniquity that has repercussions on your sons and your grandsons and your great grandsons. They're going to grow up believing that this is true. Or it could just be the target of avengement, which that's the default. That God is saying that if you do this thing, you're not just you, but your sons and your grandsons and your great grandsons will be punished. And this is not an unusual concept in the ancient world.
Right.
and I think I cited when I talked about this a proverb that was mentioned by, what was this guy's name? He was a Hittite king, and he wrote a bunch of plague poems. I've got it here somewhere.
Plague poems.
Plague poems, like Ross, because the Hittites were in the 14th century were hit by BCE were hit by a plague, and in his petition to the gods, he said, "Look, I know that that a father's sin falls upon his sons, and therefore my father's sins have fallen upon me too, and this is why we have these plagues to deal with." So my point is that it's not an unusual. Oh, here it is. So Mursili II was a Hittite king in the 14th century BCE, and he wrote. He makes this confession of his belief that it so happens that the father's sin comes upon his son, and so the sins of my father come upon me too. And so he's acknowledging this in a confessional way to deal with the plague that is killing his people, and he believes that it's as a result of something that his father did. My point is that it's not a foreign idea in the ancient world. I don't know which one to go with. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, it is one of the biggest questions, and it's occupied a lot of our time thinking about. And we do have other things. My last word on this for the night is that we do have other texts where it seems that there is this idea presented in the biblical text where you should confess your sins and the sins of your fathers. So it's you see some of that. So is it just this ancient idea that resurfaces even in the Moses scroll, certainly in the text of the Pentateuch and in the Tanakh? But that's a great question, and really I can say that just like Jason, I feel that it seems at least very unfair for a person to be punished for the sins of someone else.
I agree.
And we get that in Ezekiel very, very clearly, particularly Ezekiel chapter 18. It's like the writer of Ezekiel is trying to make it absolutely certain that you understand that if, let's say this guy has a good son, and this is what happened. If he has a bad son, what? So anyway, those are some of the texts, and I know Jason knows the Bible really well. He's trying to.
That's right. And so, Jason, I would say, because we can't go into any more detail, we've got to close up the show. But if you want to cross-reference to potentially understand this a little more, perhaps go to Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 10 to 13. There's a little bit of homework. All right.
Hey, man, wait. We got one more question, Jono.
Yeah, one more. Come on.
Yeah, and here it is. How much do you guys, this is VN Zadok, how much do you guys charge for 3 weeks to go to Israel, roughly, just so I know? Elsewhere, it's $5,000 for maybe a week. Well, VN Zadok, we can tell you to go to TanakhTours.com, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at the price there. And
I can tell you now it's too cheap is what it is.
Yeah, it is absolutely too cheap.
It's too cheap. And if you go on both tours, and many people are going on both tours, you will get a $100 combination discount as well off those prices. So TanakhTours.com, TANAKH. Join Ross and myself in November, Egypt, Jordan, and Israel.
You betcha. Hey, Jono, let's let Ezra take us out. And I just wanted to say that I'm looking forward, believe it or not, to getting into all that good priestly material in Leviticus.
We're
going to be jumping right in the middle of the priestly material of Leviticus. The Torah, it's called the Torah of the priest. So you ready to let Ezra take us out?
See you later, people.
All right, dear friends, that wraps up our journey through Exodus. From bricks without straw to the blazing glory cloud resting on the Mishkan, we've walked with Israel every step of the way. And next week, we step into the sacred terrain of Leviticus. Yes, Vayikra, the book everyone loves to skip, but not us. We're diving deep into priestly theology, purity laws, and the mysterious world of ancient Israelite ritual. So make sure to join us. Bring your curiosity, and don't forget to grab your copy of the Leviticus Torah tablet. You'll want it open and ready. It's going to be rich, strange, and beautiful. Until then, may your week be full of peace and your study full of pearls. See you next time on Torah Pearls.